Hello, it's PSYCHOCORE. Before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, only if you like what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see who's joining us from around the world. The Untold Truth About Single Women, Schopenhauer's Perspective. She told me she was happy, completely, utterly happy, but her hands were shaking as she said it. I was sitting across from her in a crowded coffee shop, watching this woman I'd known for years transform before my eyes. Sarah was 34, successful, beautiful by any standard. She had just returned from a solo trip to Thailand, her Instagram filled with pictures of sunsets and temple visits. She was glowing, she said. Free, she insisted. Living her best life, she repeated like a mantra. But I noticed something else. The way she gripped her coffee cup. The way her eyes darted around the room, never quite settling on mine. The way she spoke just a little too fast, as if silence might reveal something she wasn't ready to face. "I don't need anyone," she said, laughing. "I've got everything figured out." That's when I knew she was lying, not to me, to herself. And that's when I understood what Schopenhauer meant when he wrote about the masks we wear to hide our deepest suffering. The philosopher who dared to look into the darkness of human nature, who saw through the illusions we create to make life bearable. He understood something most people refuse to acknowledge. Sometimes our greatest declarations of independence are actually confessions of our deepest loneliness. Sarah wasn't the first woman I'd met like this. In fact, she was becoming the rule rather than the exception. Everywhere I looked, I saw women proclaiming their freedom, their strength, their complete satisfaction, with a life lived entirely on their own terms. And yet, beneath the surface, something else was stirring. Something desperate, something hungry, something that no amount of career success, travel experiences, or late-night adventures could quite satisfy. Let me tell you what I discovered about women like Sarah, what I learned about the hidden cost of radical independence, and why Schopenhauer's insights into human suffering might be more relevant today than ever before. But first, let me paint you a picture of what this actually looks like. Picture her morning routine. She wakes up in a pristine apartment, everything exactly where she left it. No one to accommodate, no one to consider. The freedom is intoxicating at first. She makes herself an elaborate breakfast, takes a photo for social media. "Living my best life," she captions it. She goes to work, excels at what she does. She's focused, undistracted by relationship drama. Her colleagues admire her dedication. Her boss promotes her. She's climbing the ladder, accumulating achievements like armor against some unnamed threat. Evenings are filled with activities, yoga classes, art galleries, dinner with friends who are also living their best lives. The conversation flows around topics of empowerment, self-love, the importance of not settling for anything less than perfect. They toast to their independence, their refusal to compromise. But then comes the moment every single one of them dreads. The moment when the last friend goes home, when the last Netflix episode ends, when the apartment falls silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city. That's when the mask slips. That's when Sarah would find herself standing at her window, looking out at the lights of other people's lives, wondering what it would feel like to have someone ask, "How was your day?" and actually care about the answer. Not because they wanted something from her, not because it was polite conversation, but because her day mattered to them simply because she mattered to them. Schopenhauer understood this paradox intimately. He wrote about the human condition as fundamentally one of want and suffering. We suffer when we desire something we don't have, and we suffer from boredom when we get what we thought we wanted. But he identified something even deeper, the suffering that comes from isolation, from the terrible weight of existing entirely within the confines of our own consciousness. The women I'm talking about have achieved something remarkable by historical standards. They have economic independence, social freedom, choices their grandmothers could never have imagined. And yet, many of them are experiencing a form of existential emptiness that their grandmothers, for all their limitations, never knew. Why? Because they've mistaken isolation for independence. They've confused self-protection with self-love. They've turned their hearts into fortresses so secure that nothing can get out, but nothing can get in either. Let me tell you about another woman I knew, Jessica, 29, marketing executive. She had a rule about dating, never more than 3 dates with the same person. Her reasoning was logical, she said. She didn't want to get attached. Attachment meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant potential pain. So she lived in a perpetual state of surface-level connection, always meeting new people, always having stories to tell, always busy with the next adventure. Her life looked exciting from the outside. Her friends envied her freedom, her apparent confidence, her ability to walk away from any situation that didn't serve her. But I noticed something during our conversations. She never talked about feelings. She talked about experiences, achievements, plans. When the conversation turned to anything deeper, anything that might require her to reveal something real about herself, she would redirect, change the subject, make a joke, order another drink. She had become a master of deflection, so skilled at avoiding intimacy that she could navigate entire conversations without revealing a single authentic emotion. She was drowning in shallow water while convincing everyone, including herself, that she was simply choosing to stay in the shallows. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he wrote about the will to live as a fundamentally blind force. These women weren't making conscious choices to avoid connection. They were being driven by a deeper instinct for self-preservation that had become pathological. Their unconscious minds had concluded that love was a threat to their survival, and so they had built elaborate psychological defense systems to protect themselves from it. But here's the cruel irony. In protecting themselves from the pain of love, they had guaranteed themselves the pain of loneliness. In avoiding the risk of heartbreak, they had chosen the certainty of emptiness. I started paying closer attention to the stories these women told about their past relationships. Invariably, there was a wound, sometimes obvious, sometimes subtle, a father who left, a first love who betrayed them, a marriage that ended badly, a pattern of being disappointed by people they trusted. And at some point, they had made a decision. Never again. Never again would they allow themselves to be that vulnerable. Never again would they give someone else the power to hurt them. They would rather be alone than risk being abandoned. It was a rational decision in many ways. Pain avoidance is a fundamental human instinct. But they had overcorrected so dramatically that they had eliminated not just the possibility of pain, but the possibility of genuine connection. Schopenhauer wrote about this tendency toward extremes. He observed that humans often swing from one form of suffering to another without finding the middle path that might offer genuine peace. These women had swung from the suffering of bad relationships to the suffering of no relationships at all. But they couldn't acknowledge this suffering because they had invested so much of their identity in the story of their independence. To admit loneliness would be to admit failure. To acknowledge their longing for connection would be to contradict everything they had spent years telling themselves and others about what they wanted from life. So they doubled down. They became evangelists for their lifestyle, trying to convince others and themselves that their way was not just valid but superior. They spoke with contempt about women who needed relationships, who settled for imperfect partners, who made compromises for love. But I could see the cracks in their facade, the way they lingered a little too long when saying goodbye, the way they asked questions about my relationship, then quickly changed the subject when I started to answer, the way they watched couples in restaurants with an expression they couldn't quite hide. It wasn't envy exactly. It was something more complex, a mixture of longing and disdain, curiosity and dismissal, hope and fear all tangled together into an emotion too complicated to name. Let me tell you about the night I finally understood what was really happening. I was at a birthday party for a mutual friend. Sarah was there, along with Jessica and several other women I'd come to recognize as part of this new demographic. They were holding court at one end of the room, regaling the group with stories from their latest adventures. The energy was high, the laughter frequent, the conversation animated. But as the night wore on, I noticed something shift. One by one, the couples at the party began to leave together, quietly, naturally, without fanfare. They would find each other across the room with a simple look, a small gesture. One would bring the other's coat. They would say their goodbyes and disappear into the night together. And I watched as the women I'd been observing became quieter. Their laughter became a little forced. Their stories became more aggressive, as if they were trying to convince everyone, including themselves, that what they were witnessing wasn't something they wanted. Sarah was the last to leave. I offered to share a cab with her, and during the ride home something in her demeanor changed. The party persona fell away, and for a moment I saw something raw and unguarded. "Do you ever wonder," she said, staring out the window, "what it would be like to have someone to go home with? Not for sex, not for excitement, just someone who would be there when you wake up, someone who would notice if you didn't come home." It was the most honest thing I'd heard her say in months. "Sometimes," she continued, "I come home and I want to tell someone about my day. Like really tell them. The boring parts, the frustrating parts, the little victories that don't mean anything to anyone else. But there's no one who cares about the ordinary moments of my life." She paused, then laughed bitterly. "God, listen to me. I sound pathetic." "You sound human," I said. But by the next day, the mask was back in place. When I mentioned our conversation, she brushed it off. "I was just tired," she said. "You know how it is after a few drinks. You get all philosophical." This is what Schopenhauer understood about the human capacity for self-deception. We are masters at creating narratives that protect us from truths we're not ready to face. We can live for years, even decades, in denial of our deepest needs and desires if acknowledging them feels too dangerous. These women had become addicted to their own defense mechanisms. The walls they had built to protect themselves had become prisons, but they had convinced themselves they were palaces. They were suffering from what the philosopher might have called a form of self-imposed exile from the human experience. But here's what I found most troubling. Society was encouraging this exile. The culture had embraced their narrative of empowerment and independence so enthusiastically that it had become almost impossible to question whether this was actually making them happy. Any suggestion that a woman might benefit from partnership, might find fulfillment in sharing her life with someone, was immediately branded as anti-feminist, regressive, patriarchal. The very idea that solitude might not be the highest form of self-actualization had become unspeakable in many circles. And so these women were trapped, not just by their own fears, but by a social narrative that made it impossible for them to admit those fears without being labeled as failures or traitors to their own gender. I started to understand that what I was witnessing wasn't just individual psychological dysfunction. It was a cultural phenomenon. An entire generation of women had been sold a bill of goods about what would make them happy, and many of them were discovering too late that the prescription wasn't working. But they couldn't admit it. The cost of admission was too high. It would mean acknowledging that they had spent years, sometimes decades, moving in the wrong direction. It would mean facing the possibility that some of the choices they had made in the name of self-preservation had actually been self-destructive. Schopenhauer wrote about the tragedy of the human condition as our inability to learn from the experiences of others. Each generation, he observed, must make its own mistakes, suffer its own consequences, discover its own truths through pain rather than wisdom. These women were living proof of his insight. Despite thousands of years of human experience suggesting that connection and community are fundamental to well-being, they had convinced themselves that they could transcend these basic needs through sheer force of will. Let me tell you about the conversation that changed everything for me. I was having dinner with a woman named Claire, 41, never married, no children. She had built a successful consulting business, travelled to over 50 countries, owned a beautiful home in an expensive neighbourhood. By every external measure, she was living a dream life. But something in her manner that night was different. She seemed exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. She ordered wine before we even looked at the menu, something I'd never seen her do. "Can I tell you something?" she said, after the waiter left with our order. "But you have to promise not to judge me." I promised. "I've been thinking about getting a dog," she said. "Not because I want the responsibility or because I think it would be fun. Because I want something in my house that would be happy to see me when I come home." She paused, swirling her wine. "How pathetic is that? I'm so desperate for connection that I'm considering taking on the care of another living being just so I can experience what it feels like to matter to someone. Anyone. Even if it's just a dog." I started to reassure her, but she cut me off. "No, let me finish. Because there's more. Last week I was at the grocery store and I saw this couple arguing about what kind of pasta to buy. Nothing dramatic, just a minor disagreement about dinner. And I stood there in the cereal aisle watching them negotiate this tiny decision, and I felt so jealous I almost started crying right there in the store." She took a long sip of wine. I was jealous of their problem. I was envious of the fact that their dinner choice mattered to someone else, that they had to consider another person's preferences, that their life was complicated by someone else's needs and wants and opinions. She looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not just sadness, but a kind of bewilderment. When did I become someone who envies other people's compromises? When did I start wanting the very things I spent years convincing myself I was lucky to avoid? That night, Claire broke open something I'd been sensing but couldn't articulate. She had reached a point that many of Hawkins' these women eventually reach, a moment of clarity that cuts through all the self-protective narratives and reveals the truth underneath. She was lonely. Not just alone, but profoundly, existentially lonely in a way that no amount of friends, activities, achievements, or experiences could touch. She was lonely in her soul, in that part of herself that could only be reached by intimate, sustained, vulnerable connection with another human being. And she was finally admitting that all her strategies for avoiding that vulnerability had succeeded only in guaranteeing that she would never experience its rewards. This is where Schopenhauer's philosophy becomes not just relevant, but essential to understanding what's happening to women like Claire, Sarah, Jessica, and countless others. The German philosopher understood that human beings are caught in a fundamental paradox. We are individual consciousness trapped in separate bodies, desperately seeking connection with other individual consciousnesses, but limited by the very nature of consciousness itself. We can never truly know another person's inner experience. We can never merge completely with another consciousness, but we can come close. Through love, through intimacy, through the willingness to be vulnerable and to accept vulnerability in return, we can achieve moments of profound connection that temporarily transcend our isolation. But this connection requires risk. It requires the possibility of pain. It requires giving up some measure of control over our own experience and allowing another person's needs, desires, and emotions to matter as much as our own. These women had made the understandable but ultimately tragic choice to avoid that risk entirely. And in doing so, they had condemned themselves to the very isolation that intimate connection is designed to heal. But here's what makes their situation even more complex. They weren't wrong about the risks. Love does involve the possibility of pain. Relationships do require compromise. intimacy does make us vulnerable to disappointment, betrayal, loss. The question isn't whether these risks exist. The question is whether a life spent avoiding them is worth living. And increasingly, women like Claire were discovering that the answer was no. I started having more conversations like the one with Claire. Once I began paying attention, I found that many women were having moments of doubt about the paths they had chosen. But these moments were brief, quickly suppressed, rarely shared. The social pressure to maintain the narrative of empowered independence was enormous. To admit loneliness was to invite a chorus of advice about self-love and self-sufficiency. To express longing for partnership was to be reminded of all the ways relationships could go wrong. To suggest that something might be missing from a life of radical autonomy was to risk being labelled as needy, desperate, or brainwashed by patriarchal expectations. So most of these women suffered in silence, experiencing their doubts as personal failures rather than natural human responses to isolation. But the doubts persisted, and for some, they began to grow. Let me tell you about the woman who finally broke the pattern. Her name was Maria, and at 37 she'd been living the independent lifestyle longer than most. She had a successful career as an architect, a sleek apartment in the city, a circle of like-minded friends, and a reputation as someone who had life figured out. But something had shifted for her over the past year. She'd been finding herself increasingly dissatisfied with the shallow connections that filled her social calendar. The conversations that once energized her now felt repetitive and hollow. The adventures that used to excite her now felt like obligations she was fulfilling to maintain her image. I realized, she told me over coffee, that I was performing my own life instead of living it. Every choice I made was calculated to prove something to myself or others about how independent and self-sufficient I was, but I couldn't remember the last time I did something simply because it brought me joy. She had reached what psychologists call a threshold moment, a point where the cost of maintaining her current pattern had become greater than the fear of changing it. I looked at my life, she said, and I realized I was living like someone who was afraid of their own feelings. Every defense mechanism I'd built, every wall I'd put up, every rule I'd made about not getting too close to anyone was just a way of avoiding the possibility of being hurt. But I was already hurting. I was just hurting in a way I'd convinced myself was noble. Maria made a decision that her friends found baffling and concerning. She started therapy. Not couples therapy or crisis counseling, but deep exploratory work aimed at understanding how she had become so afraid of vulnerability that she'd chosen isolation over connection. What she discovered in therapy was a pattern that Schopenhauer would have recognized immediately. Her fear of relationships wasn't based on a rational assessment of their risks and benefits. It was based on a childhood wound that had never healed, a deep unconscious belief that she was fundamentally unworthy of love. I thought I was protecting myself, she said, but I was actually punishing myself. I was depriving myself of the very experiences that might have healed the wound I was trying to protect. This insight didn't magically transform Maria's life overnight. Changing deeply ingrained patterns of thought and behavior is slow, difficult work, but it marked the beginning of a different relationship with herself and with the possibility of connection. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to want something more than just safety and control. She allowed herself to hope for companionship, for love, for the kind of shared life she had spent so long convincing herself she didn't need. And something interesting happened. As she became more open to vulnerability in general, she became more authentic in all her relationships. Her friendships deepened, her family connections improved. She found herself having conversations that actually mattered, sharing feelings that actually reflected her inner experience. The change was visible to everyone who knew her. She seemed more present, more engaged, more genuinely herself. The performance aspect of her life fell away, replaced by something more natural and spontaneous. Within 6 months, she met someone. Not through a dating app or a setup, but through a completely ordinary encounter that became extraordinary because she was finally emotionally available for it to become extraordinary. The crazy thing, she told me later, is that I spent so many years afraid that falling in love would mean losing myself. But the opposite happened. I found myself. The walls I'd built to protect my independence were actually preventing me from becoming who I really was. Maria's story illustrates something crucial that Schopenhauer understood about human nature. Our deepest fears are often inverted expressions of our deepest needs. The things we run from most frantically are often the very things that could heal us. These women weren't actually afraid of relationships. They were afraid of their own capacity for love, their own hunger for connection, their own fundamental human need for intimacy. They had mistaken their deepest strengths for weaknesses and spent years trying to eliminate them rather than honor them. But Maria's transformation also reveals something troubling about the cultural moment we're living in. How many women are like she was, suffering in isolation while being praised for their independence? How many have convinced themselves that their loneliness is actually enlightenment? How many are living half lives while being told they're living their best lives? Schopenhauer wrote that the mass of humanity lives in quiet desperation, going through the motions of existence without ever accessing the deeper currents of meaning and connection that make life worth living. Looking around at the landscape of modern relationships, it's hard not to see his observation as prophetic. We've created a culture that celebrates isolation as empowerment, that treats vulnerability as weakness, that encourages people to protect themselves so thoroughly from emotional risk that they eliminate the possibility of emotional reward. And we're surprised that rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide are skyrocketing. We're puzzled by the epidemic of loneliness that's affecting people of all ages and demographics. We're mystified by the growing sense of meaninglessness and disconnection that characterizes so much of contemporary life. But perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. Perhaps we're simply reaping what we've sown. A culture that teaches people to fear intimacy will inevitably produce a population of isolated individuals. A society that conflates independence with strength will inevitably create people who are too afraid to admit they need each other. The women I've been describing aren't victims of some external force. They're products of a particular historical moment, a specific set of cultural values that have told them that their deepest human instincts are signs of weakness rather than strength. But they're also living proof that those instincts can't be eliminated, only suppressed. And suppressed instincts have a way of expressing themselves in distorted, destructive ways. The loneliness these women experience isn't just an unfortunate side effect of their choices. It's their psyche's way of trying to get their attention, trying to tell them that they're moving in the wrong direction. Schopenhauer believed that suffering was inevitable in human life, but he also believed that unnecessary suffering was often the result of fighting against our own nature rather than learning to work with it. These women are experiencing unnecessary suffering because they're fighting against their own fundamental need for connection. The tragedy isn't that they chose independence. The tragedy is that they chose it out of fear rather than genuine preference. They closed doors that they might have wanted to walk through, simply because walking through them felt too risky. But here's what gives me hope. More and more women are beginning to question the narrative they've been sold. They're starting to recognize that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites, that independence and interdependence can coexist, that protecting yourself from all emotional risk also protects you from all emotional reward. They're beginning to understand that the choice isn't between being alone and being in a bad relationship. The choice is between being closed and being open, between living defensively and living courageously, between protecting themselves from life and engaging with it fully. Some, like Maria, are choosing engagement. They're doing the difficult work of healing their wounds rather than organizing their entire lives around protecting those wounds. They're risking disappointment in service of the possibility of connection. They're choosing growth over safety. Others are still trapped in their patterns, still convinced that their isolation is chosen rather than compelled, still trying to make meaning from lives that feel increasingly empty. But the conversation is changing. The questions are being asked. The assumptions are being challenged. And maybe that's enough for now. Maybe the first step toward healing is simply acknowledging that there's something to heal. Maybe the path forward begins with admitting that the path we've been on isn't leading where we thought it would. Schopenhauer wrote that wisdom comes not from avoiding suffering, but from understanding its true causes. For the women I've been describing, wisdom might come from understanding that their suffering isn't caused by the world's failure to appreciate their independence. It's caused by their own failure to honor their interdependence. We are social beings. We are designed for connection. We find meaning through relationship, purpose through love, fulfillment through the willingness to be vulnerable with and responsible for each other. These aren't weaknesses to overcome. They're strengths to celebrate. They're not signs of inadequacy. They're expressions of our deepest humanity. The women who recognize this and act on it will find their way back to themselves. The women who continue to fight it will continue to suffer, no matter how many achievements they accumulate or adventures they experience. Because in the end, Schopenhauer was right. We are all alone in our own consciousness, but we don't have to live as if that isolation is the only truth about human existence. We can choose connection. We can risk love. We can allow ourselves to matter to others and to let others matter to us. That choice is always available, even for the woman who has spent years convinced she doesn't need anyone, even for the woman who has built her entire identity around her independence, even for the woman who has forgotten what it feels like to let someone else see her as she really is. The door is always there. The question is whether she'll find the courage to walk through it. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel, like, share, and subscribe. Please leave a comment telling us what you think of this video.